There was a winter morning in New York when the harbor lay under a veil of fog and the world of money moved as if half asleep, steam curled from the chimneys of J.P. Morgan's mansion on Madison Avenue, and the snow in the street turned gray under wheels and boots. Inside, under high ceilings and heavy portraits, a coal fire crackled in the library, throwing orange light across rows of leather-bound ledgers and star charts that did not belong in a banker's house. The charts lay on a side table, quietly out of place between reports from railroads and telegrams from London, circles, symbols, lines of ink drawn with careful hands, Mars in one house, Saturn in another, the strange hieroglyphics of an older language of risk. To the clerks who sometimes dusted the room, they were simply Mr. Morgan's curiosities. To the old man who sat in the armchair nearby, they were something more, invisible currents beneath the tides of money, another way to listen to the world. Across from him stood a man who did not fit the image of Wall Street power at all. His suit was clean but plain, his beard trimmed, his eyes a little too bright for a room of bankers. He carried no briefcase stuffed with contracts, only a leather folio rolled under one arm. His name, in the whispered corners of drawing rooms and back offices, was mentioned with half amusement and half unease. Some called him an astral mathematician, others a star doctor for the rich. To the few who knew him well, he was simply Heinrich. Heinrich had come from Europe years before with nothing but his charts and his accent and an unshakable conviction that the sky, read properly, was as useful a ledger as any book on a banker's desk. In Vienna he had studied astronomy until the numbers began to feel like music. In Zurich he had fallen in with a circle of esoteric thinkers who spoke of cycles, epochs, and the strange way history seemed to follow patterns larger than any single man. Where others saw superstition, he saw a language of timing. Where others saw myth, he saw metaphor for forces too subtle to weigh on a scale. Their paths crossed not at a, as rumors would later claim, but in the quietest way possible, through curiosity and an introduction. A younger associate of Morgan, amused by European fashions of mysticism among intellectuals, had once brought Heinrich to a small dinner. The conversation at the table had jumped from art to industry, from opera to overproduction. Of steel. Heinrich listened more than he spoke, until someone in jest asked him whether the stars could predict the price of coal. He did not claim they could. Instead, he asked a different question. Have you never noticed, gentlemen, how fear and confidence travel in waves? As if a hidden clock were beating behind human affairs. He spoke not of single days or dramatic omens, but of broader moods, periods when expansion came easily and seasons when contraction seemed inevitable, regardless of individual effort. It was not the foretunneler's promise of you will meet a dark stranger, but something colder, more structural. Humans, he said, never moved entirely free of rhythm. For a man like J.P. Morgan, who had spent his life reading not only numbers but the temperature of entire markets, something about that argument rang familiar. He had seen panic spread like fire with no new fact to justify it. He had watched confidence return when, on paper, nothing fundamental had changed. Timing, he already knew, was everything. Heinrich simply offered him another clock to check alongside the others. So one winter later, here they were, a banker and his unconventional consultant, sitting in a library while the city moved through its ordinary day. You understand, Morgan began, his deep voice carrying the weight of decades. I do not ask you whether a star will make a man rich. Men make themselves rich, or they don't. What interests me is the weather. Heinrich smiled at that, a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. The weather of time, he replied, the climate in which you choose to act. On the table between them lay a chart for the coming months, a wheel divided into 12 traced with fine lines annotated with dates that corresponded not only to planetary positions but to expected moments of pressure in the markets, days when loans came due, weeks when large issues of stock would be floated, periods when, by Heinrich's calculations, patience would be wiser than aggression. They went through it step by step. Heinrich did not tell Morgan buy this railroad or sell that steel trust because Mars stood here and Saturn stood there. Instead, he framed his language in terms a financier could use. He spoke of favorable windows for initiating new ventures versus consolidating old ones, of periods of increased volatility when rumors could spin out of control, when the fuse of panic would be particularly dry. Morgan listened in the way he listened to any advisor. He considered worth his time, with skepticism sharpened by attention. He cross-checked what he heard against his own reading of credit flows, against letters from Europe, against cargo volumes and construction permits. Slowly, over months, he began to notice something he could not easily dismiss. There were stretches when Heinrich advised caution, and indeed the markets seemed jumpier, more moved by whispers than by facts. There were windows when Heinrich described an underlying current of expansion, and in those same weeks, deals seemed to move. More smoothly, resistance lower, confidence higher. It was never precise enough to use like an equation. Morgan did not flip through ephemerides instead of balance sheets, but gradually he allowed this extra layer of timing into his already complex calculus. If a large merger could be closed in any of 3 weeks, and no practical obstacle favored one over the other, he might nudge toward the one Heinrich described as less prone to sudden shocks. If a new issue could wait a fortnight without harm, and the present stretch was labeled unstable in the astrologer's quiet notation, he would. Wait, he never broadcast this. In the boardrooms and bank parlors of Wall Street, he remained the same imposing figure, nose reddened by rosacea, cigar in hand, voice that could quell a room. He spoke in the language of collateral and guarantees, of gold shipments and credit lines. The men who sat opposite him at long tables rarely imagined that, at home in the evenings, alongside telegrams from London, there might also be a note in his hand, delay signing until after mid-month. They certainly did not guess that such. A note was written after a conversation about aspects and transits. For Heinrich, those quiet notes were the only visible evidence that his work mattered. He did not own railroads. He did not sit on the boards of steel companies. His influence, if it could be called that, flowed through suggestion and timing. He lived in a modest townhouse, far from the marble and oak of financial palaces, where he kept his own library of ephemerides, astronomical tables, philosophical treatises, and the occasional newspaper clipping about market panics and recoveries. Late at night he would draw connections in a notebook, not to prove that fate ruled men, but to refine his sense of when the collective mind grew more fearful, more reactive, more willing to stampede. He was not immune to doubt. At times he wondered whether he was merely very good at reading psychology and dressing it in the language of the sky. Some months seemed to align with uncanny precision, a harsh configuration in his charts and a sudden contraction of credit, or a rare harmonious one and a surprising burst of opportunity. Other times reality refused to cooperate with his patterns. A war rumor would suddenly clear, or a government intervention would steady a market he had expected to buckle. Yet he kept studying, adjusting, comparing notes with the one client who took his work seriously but never worshipped it. Morgan, in his own way, did the same. He tested Heinrich's suggestions the way he tested a new bond issue, not all at once, but in increments, weighing the outcome over years. Men who knew JP only from his public battles imagined that he trusted only force large positions, decisive moves, the crushing of opposition. Fewer understood that his power also came from patience, from a willingness to wait for the right moment and strike when the tide already favored him. In that sense, the astrologer's language of tides and cycles fell on fertile ground. It gave names to instincts the financier already had but rarely articulated. It did not change his nature so much as lent him one more instrument in a toolkit already full of them. One spring when the city air turned softer and rumors of yet another. Panic whispered through the corridors of banks. They met again in the same library under the same stern portraits and the same quiet ticking of a clock. Your charts, Morgan said, tapping the edge of the folio, tell me this season is less steady than the last. Heinrich nodded. There is tension beneath the surface, fear looking for a spark. You think it will break? I think, Heinrich answered carefully, that if men who hold the levers of trust act with steadiness, the tension can be guided rather than left to erupt. The pattern suggests strain, not inevitability. Morgan absorbed this, eyes narrowing. He thought of depositors in hundreds of small banks whose confidence was more fragile than any metal in the vaults. He thought of how quickly a line of worried men outside a branch could turn into headlines, how headlines became reality. In that case, he said at last, we prepare the lines of credit now, not later, quietly, before anyone is running 2 doors. Was this decision born of astrology, or of experience, or of both braided together? No one in the room could say. What could be seen, weeks later, was that when tremors did begin, a rumor here, a failure there, the resources to calm them were already in motion. Loans extended, words spoken at the right hour, a show of strength when it mattered most. The panic that might have unfolded never quite caught fire. Heinrich read about it in the papers like everyone else and underlined dates in the margin, comparing them to his notes. Morgan read the same headlines with a different satisfaction, not at having cheated fate, but at having once again kept the machinery of credit from tearing itself apart. To others, the episode became just another example of his uncanny sense of timing, the legend that grew in later decades of a titan of finance secretly ruled by the stars, taking orders from a cloaked mystic in candlelit rooms, was more dramatic than anything that had actually passed between them. The truth, as it often is, was smaller and subtler, a practical man of power quietly consulting an unorthodox clock, incorporating its rhythms into choices already shaped by experience, information, and instinct. As for Heinrich, history did not carve his name into buildings. No school was named after him, no statue raised his work. Like the stars he watched, shone at a distance, its traces scattered in decisions whose true origins few would ever guess. In old age he sometimes walked past the city's banks in the evenings, looking up at lit windows and wondering whether anyone inside still kept a chart by their desk or whether the age of his craft there had passed. He would never know how deeply his gentle insistence on cycles had lodged itself in Morgan's thinking, nor how many small choices of delay or acceleration had been made with his phrases. Echoing quietly in the back of a powerful mind, what he knew and held to was simpler, that even in the heart of iron and ledgers there had been a listening. That for a time a man who moved millions had paused to consider the invisible weather of human mood and fear. In that sense, their story was less about prediction than about humility, the recognition that no one, however rich or ruthless, stands entirely outside of rhythm. Markets rise and fall, empires expand and contract, fortunes are made and lost. A chart is one way to picture those swells. A balance sheet is another. Between them, in the narrow space where numbers on paper meet the beating of human hearts, men like J.P. Morgan made their choices. And somewhere in that same narrow space, an old astrologer once laid a quiet hand on time and tried, in his own way, to feel which way the tide would turn.